I had been watching the human delegation for 6 hours before I realized none of them had moved, not fidgeted, not shifted in their seats, not exchanged whispers or passed notes, or done any of the 100 small restless things that living creatures do when they are made to sit still for too long. They just sat there, the four of them, behind their low curved table at the far end of the conclave chamber, with their hands folded and their eyes forward and their faces carrying an expression I could not name. Not patience, not boredom, something quieter than both. I am Velcatherine, and I have served as Senior Xenological Attaché to the Galactic Conclave for 61 years. In that time I have observed delegations from 432 species. I know how beings behave when they are nervous, when they are calculating, when they are pretending not to be afraid. I know how predators sit and how prey sits and how the rare species that is, somehow both will hold itself in the uncomfortable middle ground between aggression and caution. The humans sat like none of those things. The woman leading their delegation was called Director Lena Ward. She was, by human standards, considered middle-aged, which meant she had perhaps another 30 or 40 years of useful life ahead of her, before her biology gave out. She was not physically impressive. None of them were. The four humans at that table were smaller than the Kreth delegates across the room, slower than the Varathi, and possessed of none of the bioluminescent warning coloration that made even the peaceful Solen intimidating to look at when they were displeased. What the humans had was stillness. I remember pulling up their file that afternoon. I had read it before years ago, when humanity was first admitted to the conclave as an associate member. But I had read it the way you read a file about something that does not concern you, which is to say I had read the words without absorbing them. Persistence hunters, endurance predators, unique among all known sapient species in that their primary ancestral hunting strategy involved following prey across open ground for hours, sometimes days, at a pace the prey could briefly outrun but never sustain. They did not catch things by being faster. They caught things by refusing to stop. I remember thinking when I first read that it was a quaint biological footnote, a detail about a primitive past that had nothing to do with a species now capable of building ships and attending diplomatic summits. I was not yet wise enough to understand that the past is not a footnote. The past is the foundation. Everything a species was, it still is, somewhere beneath the surface. The summit that day was meant to be routine, trade agreements, corridor usage rights, a vote on whether to extend provisional membership to the Yeth Collective, who had been waiting for 11 years and were beginning to lose patience. I had attended 300 summits exactly like it. I expected to file a brief, unremarkable report and return to my quarters before the evening meal cycle. Then the Kreth Hegemon's representative stood up. His name was Counselor Dath, and he was enormous by any standard, with layered armor plaiting along his shoulders and neck that served no diplomatic function but sent a message regardless. The Kreth were a Tier 3 military power, which in conclave terms meant they were among the dozen species capable of projecting significant force across multiple star systems. They were not the most powerful species in the room, but they were the most comfortable with the idea of power, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. Counselor Dath announced, in a tone that managed to be both formal and contemptuous, that the Kreth hegemony had assumed administrative control of the Tyrannus corridor effective 3 days prior. The room changed temperature, not literally, but in the way rooms do when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The Tyrannus corridor was a stretch of navigable space that connected 12 human colony worlds to the main trade lanes. Cutting it off did not destroy those colonies. It simply meant they could not be resupplied, could not send their exports out, could not receive the medical shipments and technical components and communications relays that kept a colony alive and functioning. The Kreth had not attacked anyone. They had simply placed themselves in a doorway and stopped responding to knocking. It was legally an act of coercion dressed in the language of administrative procedure. The Kreth were skilled at that. I watched Director Ward while Counselor Dath spoke. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not change. The aide to her left, a young man named Corporal Owen Gray, let his jaw tighten very slightly for just a moment before he controlled it. The other two humans remained perfectly still. I noted the jaw. I noted that Ward herself showed nothing at all. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. 17 species took the floor. There were arguments about legal definitions of administrative zones. There were procedural challenges to the Kreth claim of prior territorial interest. There were expressions of concern, calls for mediation, requests for clarification. The Varathi ambassador spoke for 22 minutes about the importance of established transit rights under the Conclave Charter. The Solen delegation presented a historical precedent from 800 years ago. The Yeth observer, who had no vote, offered an opinion anyway, and was politely ignored. Director Ward sat through all of it without speaking. I found myself watching her more than I watched the speakers. There was something in her quality of attention that I had not seen before. She was not simply waiting for her turn. She was listening the way that a being listens when it is making decisions that have nothing to do with the room it is currently sitting in. When the session chair finally called on the human delegation, Ward stood. She straightened her jacket. She looked around the room once briefly, meeting eyes with no one in particular, and then she spoke. She said, "We would like 48 hours, please." That was all. There was a pause. The session chair, an elderly Polith named Mediator Hess, asked her to clarify what the human delegation intended to accomplish in 48 hours. Ward said they would appreciate the time to consult with their government. Mediator Hess asked whether the human delegation was formally requesting council mediation in the dispute. Ward said, very pleasantly, that would not be necessary. Councillor Doth made a sound that his translator rendered as mild amusement. The council voted to grant the 48-hour recess. It was not a difficult vote. No one had pressing business, and frankly, the general sentiment was that the request was either a delaying tactic or a sign that the human delegation needed time to contact home and receive instructions on how to navigate a situation they were not prepared for. Associate members often needed that kind of hand-holding. It was considered part of the process. I voted with the majority. I filed a brief note in my personal log. Humans have requested 2-day recess, likely to consult with central government regarding Kreth corridor action. Expect formal petition for mediation to follow. No unusual activity anticipated. I closed my log. I was wrong about every single part of that note, but I did not know it yet. What I did know, though I would not articulate it until much later, was that something about the way Lena Ward said those 7 words had unsettled me in a way I could not explain. She had not asked for 48 hours out of confusion or uncertainty. She had asked for it the way you ask for something you already know you are going to receive, because refusing it would cost more than granting it, and you have already calculated that. She had asked for 48 hours the way you ask for exactly the amount of time you need. I went back to my quarters that evening and pulled up the full xenological file on humanity. Not the summary, the full file. Every report ever submitted by a conclave observer with direct human contact. Every biological assessment, cultural survey, historical cross-reference. I had a bad feeling I could not justify, and when I have a bad feeling I cannot justify, I read. The file was very long. I stayed up well past my normal sleep cycle reading it. By the time I reached the section on ancestral hunting strategies and the physiological basis for what human researchers called the stress response, I had stopped feeling unsettled and started feeling something else entirely. I read the phrase, "The body does not distinguish between a hunt and a war," 3 times. Then I got up and made myself something warm to drink, and sat by my window and looked out at the lights of the station, and I thought about the way Lena Ward had sat still for 6 hours without fidgeting, and about how the human file noted that persistence hunters do not show effort on their faces because showing effort is a disadvantage, and about how the section on human physiological response to perceived threat described not a fight or flight pattern, but something the researchers called focused activation, characterized by reduced emotional display, increased metabolic efficiency, and a measurable narrowing of cognitive focus toward a single objective. I sat there for a long time. Then I sent a message to my research assistant and told her I needed everything we had on human military history compiled and on my desk by morning. She sent it back within the hour. She is very efficient. I did not sleep that night. The first 8 hours of the recess were the most unremarkable 8 hours I had experienced in years. The human delegation returned to their assigned quarters aboard the station. They requested no meetings. They sent no communications through conclave channels. Owen Gray was seen in the commissary at some point, where he purchased 3 different food items, ate them quickly, and left. One of the other aides, a woman I had catalogued as Lieutenant Clara Voss, was spotted in the station's small garden corridor walking at a brisk pace and apparently listening to something through a personal audio device. She did not look tense. She looked like someone who walks because walking helps them think. I instructed my junior staff to maintain passive observation and flag anything unusual. Nothing was flagged. In those same 8 hours, I finished reading the military history file my assistant had compiled. I say finished, but what I mean is that I read until my eyes stopped cooperating and I had to stop. The file covered approximately 4,000 years of documented human conflict. I did not reach the end. I did not need to. By the time I had gotten through the first 800 years, I understood something I had not understood before, which was that humanity did not experience war the way other species experienced war. Most sapient species go to war reluctantly. Even the Kreth, who are aggressive by nature and do not pretend otherwise, treat conflict as a tool that must be carefully deployed, because it is expensive and destructive and carries the risk of escalation toward outcomes no one can control. The Kreth are dangerous because they are willing to use the tool more readily than most. But they still understand it as a tool. The humans in that historical record experienced war as something else. They experienced it as a condition, a state of being that their civilization had lived inside for so long that they had developed an entire parallel culture around it. Logistics systems, medical protocols, supply chains designed to function under sustained attack, economic frameworks built to survive the destruction of infrastructure, psychological support networks, architectural principles for rebuilding quickly after total loss. They had not invented these things for interstellar conflict. They had invented them fighting each other, for thousands of years, on a single planet, with no one to ask for help and no option to leave. I flagged my own observation in my personal log and then stared at it for a long time. Humanity has been training for war for 40,000 years. They did it to themselves. They had no choice. At hour 9, something changed. My monitoring system flagged an unusual pattern in the civilian shipping lanes adjacent to the Tyrannus corridor. Ships were moving, not military vessels. The human delegation had no military vessels anywhere near conclave space, which was partly why the Kreth had felt comfortable making their move. What was moving were freighters, survey ships, 3 former colony transports that according to registry records had been decommissioned, 2 commercial ore carriers registered to a private company on a human world called Keller's Station, and a remarkable number of small fast ships that the registry listed as independent utility vessels, which is the kind of category that covers almost anything and therefore means almost nothing. None of these ships were doing anything aggressive. None of them were on an attack vector. They were simply moving, from many different points across several systems, on trajectories that my navigation analyst said would bring them to a general area near the outer edge of the Tyrannus corridor in approximately 30 to 38 hours. I looked at those trajectories for a long time. Then I called the analyst back and asked her what she made of it. She said it looked like a migration pattern, or a gathering. I asked her, a gathering for what purpose? She did not have an answer. I went to the human quarters and knocked on the door. Clara Voss answered. She looked at me with calm brown eyes and said Director Ward was resting. But could she help me? I said I had some questions about the shipping movements in the corridor region. Voss looked at me pleasantly and said she was not authorized to discuss operational matters, but she would let Director Ward know I had called. Then she smiled, which on a human face means very different things in different contexts, and I was not sure which one this was. She closed the door quietly. I stood in the corridor for a moment, feeling something I could not quite name. Then I went back to my office and watched the ship movements. By hour 14, the ships had stopped behaving like a migration. The word my analyst used reluctantly after I pressed her was convergent. They were coming together, not to one point but to a formation, a wide, distributed formation that wrapped around 3 sides of the outer corridor approach, like a hand wrapping around a doorframe. From the inside, I pulled up a 3-dimensional projection and looked at it from every angle. Then I understood what I was looking at, and I sat down, and I was quiet for a long time. They were not attacking the corridor. They were not trying to push through the Kreth position from the outside. They were coming up from around and behind, from directions the Kreth had not secured, through routes the Kreth had not thought to watch because they were not military routes. They were civilian routes, commercial lanes, survey paths, the kinds of approaches you only know about if you have been quietly navigating that region of space for years. The formation, when it completed, would not be positioned to fight the Kreth fleet inside the corridor. It would be positioned to ensure the Kreth fleet inside the corridor could not leave, not without going through 300 human civilian vessels distributed across every viable exit vector. I called my analyst and asked her a question I already knew the answer to. I asked her how long a fleet positioned inside a corridor could sustain itself without outside resupply. She told me, it was not a long time. At hour 22, the Kreth observer post at the corridor entrance sent an urgent communication to the conclave. I was copied on it because monitoring unusual diplomatic developments was my job. The Kreth requested clarification on the legal status of civilian vessels operating in the approach zones adjacent to the corridor. They wanted to know whether the conclave would consider the movement of these vessels a hostile act. The conclave legal office took 4 hours to respond. Their answer was that civilian vessels operating on registered commercial and survey routes could not be classified as hostile actors under existing conclave law, even when their cumulative positions created a logistically inconvenient situation for another party. Logistically inconvenient situation. I remember reading that phrase and almost smiling. The Kreth sent 2 more communications after that. Both were phrased as requests for clarification. The second one was notably less formal than the first. Something in the phrasing had changed in a way that was small but unmistakable. The way the tone of a being's voice changes when they have realized that the ground they were standing on is not as solid as they thought. At hour 36, the human ship stopped moving and held their positions. There were 312 of them, by my count, spread across every approach to the corridor like a net that had been thrown with tremendous precision and very little noise. None of them were armed, or rather, none of them were reporting as armed. And under conclave law, a civilian vessel that is not reporting weapons is a civilian vessel, regardless of what else it might be. I went back to the human file and read the section on sieges. It was a very long section. Humans had been conducting sieges for most of their documented history. A siege, in the most basic terms, is not an act of destruction. It is an act of patience. You surround something. You wait. You do not spend your resources attacking. You simply ensure that the thing inside cannot receive anything it needs until it makes the decision you want it to make. Persistence hunters. At hour 47, Director Ward appeared at my office door without knocking. She was carrying 2 cups of something warm that turned out to be human coffee, which she had apparently convinced the station's food system to produce through a series of specific instructions she gave, in a tone that did not quite constitute a demand but left very little room for the machine to decline. She handed me one of the cups. I took it. She said, "I thought you might want to see the projection." She placed a small device on my desk. A 3-dimensional display built itself above it, quiet and clean. There were the 312 human vessels. There was the corridor. There was the Kreth fleet, clearly visible on their internal sensors, sitting in a space they had taken because they expected no one to challenge them. Ward pointed to the outer boundary of the formation. She said that what I was looking at was not a military action. What I was looking at was a routing adjustment. A large number of civilian vessels had, entirely within their legal rights, chosen to conduct their commercial operations along routes that happened to form a perimeter around a contested transit zone. They had not fired anything. They had not made any threatening communications. They had simply decided, collectively, to be exactly where they were. "We can maintain this for years," she said, not proudly, simply factually the way you state the properties of a material. The Kreth have 2 weeks of sustainable operations in there before they start having to make uncomfortable choices. She took a sip of her coffee. "We've done this before," she said. "A long time ago, we called it a siege. We got very good at it." I looked at the projection. I looked at her. She looked back at me with those calm eyes that I now recognized as not being patient or bored, but something else entirely. Something I had not had a word for when I first saw it and now had one for, though it was a word from the human file and not from my own language. The word was locked in, focused activation, a being that has chosen its objective and simplified everything else. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. She considered the question. "The specific formation was built in about 16 hours, she said. "But the framework for it has been in our contingency files for a long time. We plan for things we hope will never happen. It is a habit we have had trouble breaking." At hour 48, the Kreth fleet began to move. They exited the corridor through the center line, which was the only approach not covered by the human formation. They did not announce this as a withdrawal. Their official communication to the conclave described it as a redilement of assets to priority zones. Councillor Dath filed a formal notice that the Kreth hegemony was voluntarily releasing administrative oversight of the corridor in the interest of regional stability. The conclave chamber, when this announcement was read out, was silent for 4 full minutes. Not the silence of people thinking about what to say. The silence of people who have witnessed something they were not prepared for and need a moment to absorb it. I looked across the room at the human delegation, who had returned to their table with the same arrangement as before. Ward in the center, Gray to her left, Voss to her right, the fourth aide, a man named Corporal Edward Mast, at the far end. None of them were smiling. None of them were celebrating. They sat with the same stillness they had held for hours the day before, and the day before that, watching the room with the particular quality of attention that I now had a name for. I thought about the human file. I thought about persistence hunters. I thought about the phrase I had read 3 times at 2 in the morning in my quarters. The body does not distinguish between a hunt and a war. I thought about the 48 hours they had asked for. They had not asked for 48 hours because they needed to consult their government. They had asked for 48 hours because they needed exactly 48 hours. And they had known that before they asked, and they had done everything they intended to do, in precisely the time they said they would need. with 312 ships that appeared from nowhere, because they had not come from nowhere, they had come from everywhere, carefully and quietly and without a single shot fired. I opened my personal log and stared at the note I had written 2 days ago. Expect formal petition for mediation to follow. No unusual activity anticipated. I deleted it. Then I opened a new entry and sat there for a moment, thinking about what to write. I typed, "We have been classifying this species incorrectly. Begin full review immediately." Then I went to find Director Ward and ask if there was more coffee. The emergency session was called within an hour of the Kreth withdrawal, and I had never seen the chamber fill that quickly. Senior Arbiter Vasilanther arrived before his usual escort. He was, by any standard, the oldest active member of the conclave, with 900 years of institutional memory behind his yellowed compound eyes, and he moved with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had long ago stopped hurrying, because he had learned that hurrying changed very little. But he moved quickly that morning, I noticed. The formal agenda item was brief: review of the Tyrannus corridor situation and assessment of current status. What the agenda did not say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that we were there to figure out what had just happened and why none of us had seen it coming. The Kreth representative, Councillor Dath, did not attend. He sent a deputy. I stood at the side of the chamber and watched the session unfold with a feeling in my chest that I would not have had a name for a week ago. It was not quite fear, it was not quite awe, it was the particular sensation of realizing that the map you have been using is drawn incorrectly and you have been confidently navigating by it for 40 years. Director Ward sat through the entire session without speaking. She was not called upon. The chamber was busy processing what the Kreth had done, and how the conclave had responded, and whether new corridor protection protocols needed to be established. The humans were present in the room, but they were not the subject of conversation. They were treated, still, as a minor delegation from a minor species that had stumbled into a fortunate outcome. I kept watching Ward. At one point Vasilanther, from his high seat, looked directly at her. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She met his gaze and held it without expression. He looked away first. That night I assembled my research team. There were 6 of us, and I told them we were beginning a full xenological review of the human species, reclassification level depth, and that I needed everything. Not summaries, not overviews. Every primary source, every direct observation report, every survey of human space that had been filed with the conclave in the past 40 years. Every piece of cultural or historical data we had access to. My team was well-trained and professional. None of them asked why. They began pulling files. Over the next 10 days I barely left my research space. The first thing we found, which took 2 of my analysts 3 full days to compile properly, was the scope of human military history on their home world. I had read parts of it the night before the recess. Now I read all of it that we had, and I read it systematically, and what I found was not an aggressive species that liked to cause harm. That would have been simpler, and in its way, easier to understand. What I found was something more unusual. Humanity had been at war with itself, on and off, for the entire length of its recorded history. Not because its individuals were unusually violent by biological standards, but because its civilizations had developed, over thousands of years, a level of organizational complexity and technological capability that allowed small disputes to become enormous ones with remarkable speed. A disagreement between 2 groups of humans could, and often did, expand to involve hundreds of millions of participants within the span of a single generation, and then it would end, and they would rebuild, and they would go on. The recovery patterns were what made my analyst researcher Holt say, on the 3rd day, in a voice that was quieter than her normal voice, "I don't understand this." She pulled up a regional map on the display. One specific area of the human home world had been, according to historical records, involved in 2 separate periods of total civilizational collapse within 30 years of each other. Both times, the urban infrastructure was largely destroyed. Both times, the population was dramatically reduced. Both times, within a single human generation, that same region had become the leading economic and cultural center on the continent. I looked at the data. I asked Holt what she made of it. She said, "Other species don't do this. When we collapse, we stay collapsed or we recover slowly over centuries. This region of Earth collapsed twice in 30 years, and both times it came back stronger than before." She paused. "I think the word for it is resilience, but that word feels insufficient." I wrote in my log, "Human civilization treats catastrophe as a set point, not an end point. Investigate mechanisms." The mechanisms, when we found them, were not mysterious. They were just the product of necessity applied over a very long time. Because humans had spent so much of their history in conflict and recovery, they had built their social and organizational systems to absorb enormous shocks without collapsing entirely. Their supply chains were redundant by design. Their knowledge preservation was distributed. Their community structures were built around small tight networks that could function independently of larger systems when those larger systems failed. When you destroyed the top of the structure, the lower layers were already equipped to continue. This was not natural resilience. It was engineered resilience. They had built it because they had needed it, and they had needed it because they had been destroying each other's structures for millennia. I kept writing. What the Conclave had classified as a weakness, which was human emotional intensity, revealed itself on closer examination to be something more complicated. We had looked at human emotional responses in high-stress situations and we had seen beings that shouted, wept, went still with anger, laughed at inappropriate moments, formed intense loyalties to small groups that appeared to override rational self-interest, and occasionally continued to function in circumstances that should, by any biological metric, have caused neurological shutdown. What we had missed was that none of this was malfunction. I had one of my team members, researcher Doyle, compile a specific subfile on documented human behavior in extreme situations, combat situations, disaster response, long-duration hostile environment operations. What Doyle found and presented to the team on day 6 with a look on his face that suggested he had not slept was a pattern. In every documented extreme situation, the humans who performed at the highest level were not the ones who showed the least emotion. They were the ones who had the most effective relationship with their emotions. They knew what they were feeling and they used it. Fear, which in most species produces hesitation, in highly trained humans produced what their own psychological literature called controlled intensity, a narrowing of focus that most other species could not replicate outside of pharmaceutical assistance. The anger response, which we had categorized as a liability, was in fact associated in humans with increased physical capacity and reduced sensitivity to pain during short periods of peak stress, and the loyalty bonds. The small group loyalties that seemed irrational, they were not irrational. The psychological literature was very clear. Human small group loyalty, particularly in a military or high-stress context, was the single most powerful motivational force in the human behavioral repertoire. A human who was afraid for themselves might stop. A human who was afraid for the people next to them would not stop. Not because they had suppressed the fear, but because the fear had been redirected into protective action, and that redirection produced, physiologically, something closer to a state of focused determination than to panic. They had evolved it. Millennia of hunting in small groups, fighting in small groups, surviving in small groups. The pack bond was not a social nicety. It was a survival engine. I wrote in my log. What we diagnosed as emotional instability is in fact a multi-system combat capability that we do not have an equivalent for in any other species in our records. It requires reclassification. On day 8, we reached the technology section. In the 40 years since humanity's admission to the Conclave, as an associate member, their access to Conclave standard technology had been, by design, limited. Associate members received observation rights, communication frameworks, basic medical and scientific exchange. They did not receive military technology. They did not receive advanced propulsion blueprints. This was standard policy, designed to prevent rapid destabilization of the technology gap that kept newer species from becoming threats to established ones. The humans had received none of those things. They had received the public domain version of what was available to any observer with a pass to the Conclave archives, scientific papers, general engineering principles, the kind of material that any competent species with sufficient background could read and file away. What they had done with it was not file it away. My technology analyst, a careful methodical being named researcher Pren, who did not use casual language and was not given to dramatic statements, placed a comparative chart in front of me on day 8. On one side were 17 pieces of Conclave standard technology, as they had existed at the time of human admission. On the other side were the current human versions of those same technologies, as reported by survey teams and commercial observers over the past 4 decades. They improved on 14 of them, Pren said. I looked at how significantly, in 3 cases substantially. One of the 14 is performing at a level we do not currently understand. Our engineers reviewed the human variant of the deep space communication relay and have not been able to explain why it is more efficient than ours. By the margin it is. They believe there is a principle at work in the design that we have not identified yet. I sat with that for a long time. They had not been given the tools. They had been shown the tools, from a distance, and they had gone home and built something better. Not because they had more resources or more time or more scientific infrastructure. Because when they looked at a system, they could not stop thinking about how to improve it. The same drive that had produced generation after generation of weapons improvements on their home world, the same restless, innovative pressure that had turned simple bows into complex siege machinery, into firearms, into the vessels currently sitting in my hangar bay, had turned its attention to conclave technology and gotten to work. We had thought they were too primitive to be a concern. We had given them 40 years of access to our science. I called the full team together on day 10 and shared everything. We sat in my research space for 4 hours going through the findings together, and I watched my team, who were experienced professionals, become quietly shaken in the same way I had become quietly shaken, one discovery at a time. At the end, researcher Holt said, "What do we classify them as?" I had been thinking about this for days. The conclave classification system ran from Tier 7 at the low end to Tier 1 at the high end. Tier 1 had never been used. It was reserved, per the original charter language, for species that represented what the founders had called an existential variable to galactic stability. The founders had written that definition and then spent 11,000 years not applying it to anyone, because no species they had ever encountered fit it. I said Tier 2 to start, but the recommendation will note that Tier 1 cannot be excluded. There was a silence. Then Doyle said, very quietly, "And they've been sitting in our chamber for 40 years letting us call them Tier 7. No one had an answer to that. We filed the report. Vasilanther read it overnight. The next morning he called me to his office, which he had done perhaps 4 times in my 61 years of service. And he looked at me with those ancient compound eyes and said, "Why did we think Tier 7 was appropriate?" I told him that we had seen what we expected to see. We had seen a small, short-lived species with limited fleet capacity and no formal military presence in conclave space, and we had classified accordingly. We had not looked at the substrate. We had not asked what they had been before they got on the ships. He was quiet for a long time. "Inform Director Ward," he said finally. I went to Ward's quarters. She opened the door before I knocked, which I suspect was coincidence but could not entirely rule out. I told her the conclave was formally revising the human classification from Tier 7, associate member, to Tier 2 full member, with immediate effect. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is kind of you." I could not tell if she meant it as simple courtesy or as something else. I still cannot tell. But I thought, walking back down the corridor, about researcher Doyle's words. 40 years, Tier 7, sitting in that chamber, watching, waiting, saying nothing, not because they did not know, because they saw no need to mention it. A species that has spent 40,000 years learning what it is, does not need someone else to name it. They wait to be asked, and they are very patient. It began on a morning I will not forget for the remainder of my years. The message came through the standard conclave alerts channel, which I monitor on a passive background feed. It was marked as an incident report from the Tyrannus region, which had been stable since the corridor reopening, and I almost dismissed it without reading, because stable regions generate paperwork, and paperwork generates reports, and most reports are not about anything that matters. Then I read the first line and I did not move for a long time. Harrow's Landing, human colony. Population at last census, 41,216. Nature of incident. Hostile by elements identified as the Vorthon Syndicate, a Tier 4 economic and paramilitary organization that operated across 6 systems and had a long history of aggressive resource extraction in fringe territories. They had raided colonies before, always smaller ones, always ones with limited defensive infrastructure, always ones where the expected response from the associated governing body would be measured and procedural. The incident report confirmed 14,300 casualties. I closed the report and sat in my chair and did not move for quite a long time. I knew what the Vorthan expected. I knew it because I had watched 20 years of their behavior patterns, and I knew what happened when they raided a colony, and the parent species filed a petition with the conclave. There would be a formal complaint. There would be a session. There would be calls for sanctions, counter-arguments from Vorthon-aligned trade partners, extended procedural debate. Eventually, several months later, a modest censure might be issued. The Vorthan would pay a fine. They would retreat slightly and wait, and then continue doing what they had been doing, a little more carefully, in a different location. That was the pattern. That was how it worked. Everyone in conclave space understood it, including the Vorthon, who had written their entire operational doctrine around it. What the Vorthane had apparently not done, and what I realized with a cold clarity as I sat in my chair reading the incident report, was update their intelligence on the species whose colony they had just struck. The human delegation did not appear in the council chamber for 3 days. I checked every morning. Their table was empty. I sent a formal inquiry through diplomatic channels asking whether the human representatives required support resources or wished to schedule a Council session. I received a brief reply from Owen Gray acknowledging receipt of my message. Nothing else. On the second day, I accessed the human public broadcast networks. These were open channels, available to any observer with a basic receiver, and I had monitored them occasionally over the years as a cultural observation exercise. What I found when I tuned in on that second day stopped me from doing anything else for 4 hours. Every channel was running the same content. Footage of Harrow's landing, the colony before the attack from survey records, the colony after the attack from emergency response teams, and then, slower, quieter, something else. Each name appeared on screen for a few seconds, accompanied by what I came to understand was a brief image, or a short fragment of recorded voice, or a still photograph. Not every victim had all three. Some had only a name, but there were 14,300 of them, and the broadcast was running through each one in order. And it was clearly going to continue until it had gone through all of them. I watched for 4 hours. I watched humans sit in front of these broadcasts on their ships, in their homes, in the waiting rooms of stations. I watched them sit still, the way I had first seen Lena Ward sit still in the council chamber, with that quality of attention that was not patience and not numbness. I remembered the file. Small group loyalty as the primary motivational force, protective response as the dominant behavior under threat. The body does not distinguish between a hunt and a war. 14,000 people, each one known, each one named, each one being counted out loud by an entire species that was not yet moving but was paying very close attention. On the fourth day, the human delegation returned. The person who came to the council was not Director Ward. Ward was, I later learned, occupied elsewhere. The man who took the floor was someone I had never encountered before. He was young, by human standards. He carried himself with perfect steadiness. There was a set of scars along the left side of his neck and jaw that his collar did not fully conceal. His name, I learned from the session record, was Captain Daniel Ford. He stood at the podium and he spoke for 3 minutes and 14 seconds, which I timed. He did not raise his voice at any point. He did not use emotional language. He described, in plain direct terms, what the human government had determined and what it had decided. He said the Vorthaean Syndicate had carried out a deliberate hostile action against a civilian population under human protection. He said the human government did not intend to petition the conclave for mediation in this matter. He said the response had already been authorized. He paused at that point for exactly 2 seconds. I watched the room. I watched the Vorthaean adjacent trade delegates shift their posture. Then he said that the human government wanted to make its intentions clear before proceeding, as a matter of courtesy to the conclave and its members, and that it expected the matter to be resolved within 14 days. He stepped back from the podium. He returned to his seat. He folded his hands on the table. Senior Arbiter Vasilanther asked, after a brief pause, whether the human government was requesting any form of conclave assistance or authorization for its response operations. Ford said politely, "No." The session continued with other business. I did not hear any of it. I was watching Ford, who sat through the remainder of the session with the stillness I now recognized, and I was thinking about everything I had learned in the 10 days of the reclassification study. And I was thinking about researcher Doyle sitting in my office saying 40 years, Tier 7, just sitting there. And I was thinking about what it meant for a species that had spent most of its history at war with itself to be pointed, for the first time, at someone else. I was thinking about what 40,000 years of preparation looked like when it was used. The human response began 48 hours after Ford's statement, which suggested it had already been in motion when he delivered it. My monitoring systems flagged it not as a military operation, which would have triggered a different alert, but as a coordinated series of what appeared to be enforcement actions conducted simultaneously across 9 separate locations. Each location was a Vorthaean Syndicate installation, not the headquarters, not the command centers, the forward bases, the refueling posts, the private docking facilities where their ships were serviced and crewed and sent out again, the logistical backbone, the infrastructure that made everything else possible. They were not destroyed. They were shut down, power cut, approach lanes blocked, all communications to and from the installations routed through a human relay that provided full transparency of content to the conclave, but blocked outgoing operational instructions. The Vorthaean commanders inside those installations were not harmed. They were contained, given food and water and medical care, and told that the situation would be resolved when it was resolved. Every single action had been filed with the conclave's legal office in advance. Everyone was within the framework of member state enforcement rights under Article 7 of the Conclave Charter. Everyone had been reviewed and technically approved, in the bureaucratic backlog, 3 weeks before Harrow's landing. because the humans had filed the paperwork in anticipation of a situation that had not yet occurred. My legal advisor, when I asked him about that, went very still and then said, "They pre-filed the legal authorizations." I said yes. He said, "For a conflict that had not started yet." I said yes. He did not speak for a long time. The Vorthane Syndicate's command structure, deprived of its operational logistics and unable to coordinate a response, began to fragment on day 7. 2 of the regional faction leaders filed for independent conclave status, which was a way of separating themselves from the central authority, before the central authority's situation got worse. The central leadership issued 3 communications in rapid succession, each more urgent than the last, all of them apparently directed at allies they had believed they had. Most of those allies did not respond. The ones who did sent formal messages clarifying that they were not parties to the dispute. On day 11, the Vorthane Syndicate filed a petition for conclave mediation. On day 12, the human delegation formally declined to participate in mediation proceedings. On day 14, the syndicate ceased to exist as a functioning paramilitary organization. Its remaining assets were voluntarily restructured into a registered commercial entity with no military capacity. The faction and leaders signed a formal statement that was transmitted to the conclave and placed in the permanent record. Acknowledged the cause of the situation. It contained an apology. It was, by all legal measures, complete. I watched the final document come through the conclave record system, and I thought about Captain Ford standing at that podium, saying 14 days, as if it were a number he had already confirmed with someone. That evening, Director Ward returned to the station. She appeared in my office doorway just after my evening meal, carrying a folder of routine diplomatic documents she wanted to review with me, because there was still ordinary work to be done and the world did not stop for anything. Even the ending of a paramilitary organization that had held a significant portion of the fringe territories in an economic grip for decades. We went through the documents. At the end, when we had set the work aside, I asked her, was it planned? She thought about it for a moment. The way she thought about things, I had come to understand, involved a brief internal process that was faster than it looked. She was not deciding what to say. She was deciding how much to say. The specific response was built in 11 days, she said, but the capability for it has been in our planning files since before we joined the conclave. We plan for things we hope will never happen. She paused. This one we hoped would never happen. I believed her about the hoping part. 14,000 people, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I thought about the broadcast, the names each one. All of them, the broadcasts, I said. Every name, she agreed. We always count. We have always counted. It matters that everyone is counted. I did not have a response to that. I thought about the human file and the section on small group bonds, and what happens when those bonds extend to include a whole colony of 40,000 people spread across 3 continents of a world you have never visited, but whose faces you have seen, and whose names you broadcast. Networks read out one by one for days. The bond scales. It does not have an upper limit. I opened my personal log after she left and wrote the longest entry I had recorded in years. At the end of it, I wrote, I have been wrong about many things in my career. I have revised assessments and updated classifications and corrected errors of judgment without excessive regret because that is the nature of the work. But this one is different. We did not merely misclassify a species. We misunderstood the nature of the thing we were looking at. We saw the surface and called it the whole picture. I underlined the last line 3 times. Vasilanthar called me to his office 12 days after the Vorthon matter closed. He was seated when I arrived, which was unusual. He was generally a being who conducted important conversations standing, on the grounds that it forced everyone present to remain alert. Sitting, he had once told me, was a posture that encouraged comfortable agreements. He did not often seek comfortable agreements. That morning he was sitting. I took the chair across from him. He said, I read your preliminary report on the Vorthane response. I said I was still expanding certain sections. He said, I read the sections on pre-filed legal authorizations. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside his office window, the station's transit lanes were busy with ordinary commerce, ships moving, cargo being transferred, the regular unremarkable activity of 11,000 years of organized galactic civilization going about its day. They had planned it, he said. Not that specific situation, but something like it. They had anticipated the parameters of a situation in which a member of conclave space would take hostile action against a human population, and they had prepared, in advance, the legal, logistical, and operational framework to respond. Yes, I said, without asking us. They did not need our authorization to exercise Article 7 enforcement rights. No, he said, but most species, when they are new to the conclave, spend their early decades learning the frameworks, understanding the procedures. They ask for guidance. They seek alignment. He paused. The humans did not ask for guidance. They studied the charter and then used it more effectively than we do. I had no counter-argument because it was true. He leaned back slightly. Your report recommends Tier 2, he said. As a starting classification, yes. With a notation that Tier 1 cannot be excluded, yes. He looked at me. You know what Tier 1 means. It has never been applied. The founders wrote it and then spent 11 millennia finding reasons not to use it. I know. It means we are formally acknowledging a species that represents an existential variable to galactic stability. I know what it means. He was quiet again for a long time. They have been in our chamber for 40 years, he said. Tier 7, sitting at that small table. Saying very little. Yes, they knew what they were. I believe so. They saw no reason to correct us. I thought about Ward saying that's kind of you when I told her about the Tier 2 reclassification. I thought about the tone. I thought about what I still could not determine, whether she was being modest or whether she was being politely accurate. I think, I said slowly, that they chose to let the process work at its own pace. They understand that relationships between species take time. They are, of all the things in their file, genuinely patient. Vosalanther looked at me with the compound eyes that had seen 9 centuries of galactic history. That is a remarkable sentence, he said. A species that could have announced itself at any point. A species that had the capacity to make itself known in terms no one could misunderstand. Chose instead to sit quietly and let us take our time. Yes. Why? I had been sitting with that question for weeks. I had asked Ward directly, the evening after the Vorthon matter, though I had not framed it as clearly as Vosalanthar had just framed it. I had asked her about the 48-hour request, about the corridor action, about why, in all the years before that, the human delegation had not simply made the conclave understand what they were looking at. She had not answered right away. She had looked at her coffee cup for a moment and then she had said, because we have seen what happens when a species decides it doesn't need anyone else. We have done it to each other. Many times. We know how that story ends. I told Vosalanther what she said. I told him exactly. He was quiet for a long time. They are afraid of themselves, he said. I think it is more precise to say they respect themselves, I said. They know what they are capable of. They have spent 40,000 years living with that knowledge. And they have decided, collectively, as a civilization, that capability is not the same as justification. That being able to do something does not make it right to do it. That is not a small thing. Vosalanther said. No, I said. It is possibly the largest thing. He stood up then, he moved to the window and looked out at the transit lanes. I waited. Bring the reclass and vote to the full council, he said. Tier 1, not Tier 2 as a preliminary. Go directly to Tier 1. Let the record show that when we finally looked properly we did not look away from what we found. I said I would prepare the motion, he said. And Vel. I stopped at the door. Include my name as co-author of the reclassification report, he said. I was part of the system that spent 40 years getting this wrong. I should be part of the formal acknowledgement of that. I told him I would. The vote was 3 days later. The chamber was full in a way I had not seen since the declaration of the Reth Corridor Treaty 40 years ago, which was the last time something genuinely consequential had been decided in that room. Every species with voting rights was represented. Several sent their senior delegates personally, rather than through representatives, which was unusual and which I noted in my records. The human delegation attended. Ward was there, Gray, Voss, Ford, who had not been present at a session since his statement at the podium. One additional person I did not recognize. An older human woman with gray-streaked hair and a quiet way of watching the room that I had come to associate with a very particular kind of attention. The motion was read. The reclassification from Tier 7 associate member to Tier 1 full member, with a designation reserved for species representing an existential variable to galactic stability. The formal record of the basis for the reclassification was read in summary. The floor was opened. No one spoke against it. No one requested debate. The Kreth deputy, who I had expected to find some procedural objection, sat in silence with an expression his translator could not categorize. The vote was unanimous. When the result was announced, I watched Ward. I watched her carefully, the way I had learned to watch humans, looking at the small things, the quality of stillness, the micro-expressions that passed across the surface quickly and were gone. She did not smile. She did not stand. She sat in the same posture she had held for the entire session, and for just a moment, a very brief moment, I saw something cross her face that I had not seen there before. It was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was something older than both. Something that looked, to my inexpert xenological eye, very much like the exhaustion that follows a very long effort. The tiredness of something that has been held tightly for a very long time being for a moment set down. Then it was gone. After the session, I went to her. I told her the vote had been unanimous. She nodded. She said, "Please don't make a ceremony of it. It will go to their heads." I asked her which heads she meant. The heads of her species, or the heads of those who had misjudged them. She looked at me with those calm eyes. "Both, probably," she said. That night I sat in my office for a long time and I wrote. I wrote the full reclassification report, all of it. Every finding from every section, every data point, and historical cross-reference and capability assessment. I wrote it carefully and completely, and I wrote it because the conclave's records are permanent, and because what had happened mattered and deserved to be in those records accurately. At the very end, where the report called for a summary assessment, I sat for a long time before I wrote anything. Then I wrote, "Of all the species this body has encountered in 11,000 years of recorded observation, humanity alone has arrived at a full understanding of the distance between what a predator is capable of and what a civilization ought to do. They know what they are. They have always known. And for 40,000 years, and for the 40 years they sat in our chamber. While we failed to look properly, they chose, every day, to be something more than their capability. Not because the capability was gone, not because the restraint was effortless, but because they had seen in their own long and costly history what happens when power is not held to account by something larger than itself. That is not a small thing. It is possibly the only thing that matters. They are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. They are also, for reasons that have nothing to do with our observation, and everything to do with their own long work on themselves, exactly the species we needed to find." I set down my pen. Then I went to find Director Ward, and I asked her if she would teach me how to make the coffee. She laughed. It was a real laugh, uncomplicated and warm, and it came from somewhere that had nothing to do with diplomacy or strategy, or the long, careful weight of being what they were in a galaxy that had not been ready for them. It sounded like something that had survived a great deal and intended to keep going. I thought, standing there in the corridor of the conclave station with the sound of it still in the air, that I had spent 61 years in service to this organization, and had understood all that time that the study of other species was the study of what life could become given sufficient time and pressure and chance. I had not understood, until now, that some species use that time to become dangerous, and some use it to become wise, and the rarest ones use it to become both, and then spend the rest of their history deciding which one to be on any given morning. The humans woke up every day and made that choice. That was the whole of it. That was everything.